If you grew up in the 1970s, you probably learned how to be strong very early in life, strong in ways people still praise today. Independent strong. Reliable strong. Able to handle pressure without falling apart. But there's something almost no one ever taught you. How to be happy. And this wasn't an accident. In the 1970s, emotional language barely existed in everyday life. No one talked about anxiety. No one talked about emotional needs. No one talked about trauma unless something extreme happened. What people talked about was getting through the day, doing what needed to be done, not making things harder than they already were. If you were scared, you pushed it down. If you were sad, you stayed quiet. If something hurt, you learned to deal with it on your own. That wasn't emotional education, it was survival training. You were taught, directly or indirectly, that complaining was weakness, that asking for help was a burden, that talking about feelings didn't solve anything. So you adapted. You became capable. You became useful. You became the person others could depend on. And for a long time, that worked. You learned how to function under pressure, how to keep going when things were uncomfortable, how to stay composed even when something inside you felt off. But here's what no one warned you about. Functioning is not the same thing as living. Many people who grew up in the 1970s don't think of themselves as unhappy. They don't describe themselves as depressed. They just feel tired. Not physically tired, emotionally worn down. They've spent decades holding everything together without ever asking a simple question. Am I actually okay? Because no one ever asked them that growing up. They were praised for being strong, not for being honest. They were valued for being stable, not for being self-aware. They learned that being needed was safer than being understood, and over time that creates a strange inner world. You may notice that when life slows down, you feel restless. When there's nothing urgent to fix, you feel uneasy. When things are calm, something feels wrong. Peace feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Your nervous system learned that tension was normal. So you stay busy, you stay productive, you stay in motion, not because you love stress, but because stress feels familiar. Here's a hard truth most people never say out loud. Strength without emotional freedom eventually turns into chronic exhaustion. You can carry a lot for a long time, but carrying everything alone comes at a cost. People raised in the 1970s were rarely taught how to recognize their own emotional limits. They were taught how to override them. They weren't shown how to rest without guilt. They weren't shown how to ask for support without shame. They weren't shown how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. So, even today, rest can feel undeserved, joy can feel suspicious, and happiness can feel shallow or temporary. Not because something is wrong with you, but because happiness was never modeled as something valuable. Only endurance was. If you grew up in that era, you may struggle to name what you feel. Not because you lack depth, but because emotional language was never encouraged. You learned to stay composed, to stay quiet, to stay in control, and control became your version of safety. But control has a shadow side. It makes vulnerability feel dangerous. It makes emotional openness feel risky. It makes asking for help feel like failure. So you keep going, even when you're tired, even when something inside you is asking for attention. Here's the part that matters most. You are not broken. You are not cold. You are not incapable of happiness. You are the product of an era that prioritized survival over self-understanding, and now, as an adult, you're facing a different challenge. Not becoming stronger, but learning how to stop bracing for impact when there is none. Learning that rest is not weakness, that happiness is not laziness, that emotional awareness is not indulgence. For people raised in the 1970s, the hardest lesson often comes later in life. You don't need to earn peace. You don't need to justify joy. And you don't need to suffer to be worthy. Happiness is not something you were taught to value, but it is something you are allowed to learn. And learning it doesn't erase your strength. It finally gives it somewhere to rest.